During my tenure in the Bush administration, there wasn't, after 9/11, a single American killed in the U.S. by terrorists, and we stopped a lot of terrorists. Now, could we have done less? Maybe, but less might have resulted in attacks.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today it's been 20 years since 9/11. Is the world any safer? The U.S. has spent trillions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in the global fight on terror. Was it worth it? I speak to two people with first-hand experience crafting policy since the towers fell. First, Michael Chertoff, who led the Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush. And later, Rory Stewart, who has worked extensively in Afghanistan and served as the UK's Secretary of State for International Development. But first, hijacked planes cutting through a cloudless September sky. The Twin Towers collapsing to the ground. Black smoke billowing up from the Pentagon. That's how President Barack Obama reflected on 9/11 10 years after the towers fell. He wrote the speech in the Oval Office, then walked down the colonnade past the Rose Garden. In the background, he could hear crowds gathering, chanting, USA, USA. News that Osama bin Laden was killed in a night raid in Pakistan had already hit the streets before he even made it to the podium. Many hoped this moment would mark the end of America's long and costly war on terror. Now, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we watch scenes of terror on our screens once again, a trauma felt most deeply in Afghanistan, where bomb blasts killed U.S. military personnel, as well as scores of Afghans trying to flee the country. President Joe Biden hoped to use this moment to deliver on a campaign promise: end America's forever wars.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
And with the U.S. exit, the Taliban is now back in control. A local ISIS group has claimed responsibility for the bloody attack on August 26th, and big questions remain about what, if anything, America's war there accomplished. And remember this scene from 2003, when President Bush delivered a speech from an aircraft carrier announcing the end of U.S. military operations in Iraq, a war that actually ended 8 years later, and saw more troops on the ground from 2013 until 2017 in order to fight ISIS. Even Donald Rumsfeld joked that he had removed all of Bush's mission accomplished language from the speech, but staff had forgotten to fix the sign. Post 9/11 policies held more than just embarrassments. America's image abroad suffered too. From civilian casualties to torture and abuse at Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners were subjected to waterboarding, electrocution, and other forms of torture. Here at home, policies implemented in the name of security, including huge and at times even illegal surveillance dragnets of U.S. citizens, gave law enforcement unprecedented powers. And even while these policies have come under heat for excessive government overreach, many argued they worked. After all, the United States has avoided another catastrophic 9/11 style attack on our soil. But as America concludes its longest war, are we safer today than before the towers fell? I speak to two people who have the background to break it down for us. Michael Chertoff served as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, and Rory Stewart, who over the past 20 years has worked extensively in Afghanistan, both in his role as UK's Secretary of State for International Development and beyond. Thank you, sir, for joining us on GZERO World.
Good to be on.
So, 20 years after 9/11, how did that moment in American history change the way we think about national security for our country?
Well, I think writ large, it made us very conscious that in a global world, with global transportation and global communication, the oceans do not protect us from foreign enemies. And wars are not optional anymore. They may come looking for you, to kind of paraphrase Trotsky.
this was a period of time when the United States, I wouldn't say felt invincible, but certainly felt as if it was way on top of the global order. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The European Union had enlarged. NATO had enlarged. How dramatic and how quick was the change in view of America's role in the world? And what did that feel like to you?
We did think in the 1990s that we were at an inflection point where America was on top. There were no rivals of scale. The economy was doing well. We didn't really worry about national security threats. Cyberspace was still a kind of a curiosity, not really a major attack vector. And so I think many Americans believe that there might be some small incidents that would occur, but nothing that would threaten the United States in even nearly an existential threat. In the very short term after 9/11, there was an understandable and appropriate, a very strong focus on preventing something from happening imminently of that kind of scale. And so we needed to build a system to collect information, to collect intelligence, to examine and inspect what was coming into the country, and to begin to strengthen our critical infrastructure.
If you could have taken a decision back from the Bush administration, from a Homeland Security and national security perspective, what would it have been? Would it have been the war in Iraq, or would it have been something else?
Well, unfortunately, hindsight gives you an advantage, but I guess I would say the war in Iraq in two senses. First of all, it did distract us from Afghanistan. We may have overestimated our ability to resolve the Afghanistan conflict in a way that would be stable and balanced. And certainly from a resource and attention standpoint, Iraq drained a lot of attention. But I would also say that we were not clear about the mission in Iraq or what would happen after we won. And the planning for post-war was not what it should have been. The assessment and articulation of goals was not clear. And as a result, it became basically a magnet for all kinds of attacks on Americans that absorbed more resources, more attention, and more patience.
That's fair enough. What about on the domestic side? Obviously, trillions of dollars not just spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also spent on Homeland Security in so many different manifestations inside the United States, both in terms of the Patriot Act and the surveillance, but also the beefed up security, the necessary critical infrastructure investments. What's the one or two there that you say, we didn't do it right, we had the wrong focus, we overdid it, we overspent? What would you say 20 years on?
Well, it's a little hard to judge that because, in fact, we did not have a significant terrorist attack in the U.S. after 9/11. In fact, during my tenure in the Bush administration, there wasn't, after 9/11, a single American killed in the U.S. by terrorists, and we stopped a lot of terrorists. And even afterwards, there were more attacks that were really just inspired by terrorism, but not any global jihadis traveling in. So you would have to say that certainly we were successful in patrolling the borders against terrorism and building an intelligence capability to identify terrorists, and in hardening some of our infrastructure, like, for example, airplanes and the airports. Now, could we have done less? Maybe, but less might have resulted in attacks. So it's hard to criticize that. I think perhaps on the intelligence collection standpoint, once we had kind of calibrated what was out there, I think we might have adjusted it a little bit and maybe been, frankly, a little bit more transparent in why we were collecting what we were collecting. But I will say that a lot of the uproar about collection of metadata, which is really nothing more than who the sender of a message is, who the recipient is, and how long its duration was, I think it was slightly overdone, maybe because the scale of it seemed a little bit unaccustomed. But the fact is, one of the things we learned in looking at 9/11 is that the connectivity among the hijackers was a major factor that we could have used to frustrate the attacks. And therefore, looking for those kinds of signs and signals without getting into content, had some real value.
That makes me want to ask you a very uncomfortable question, even an inhumane one, which is, if we haven't had any major Islamic terrorist attacks inside the United States emanating from abroad, and again, I know we've had some lone wolf stuff, San Bernardino and whatnot. I mean, should your initial reaction to that be, wow, we did a fantastic job, or should it be, wow, we probably really overspent?
It's not the latter, because I'll tell you, we came close in 2005, or maybe 2006, when we had a plot that was uncovered to fly airplanes from Heathrow to North America and blow a dozen up in midair. And it was very good intelligence work. Some of the things you're talking about that allowed us to detect and stop that so nobody got killed. So the fact that we didn't have a big attack here was not an accident. And there was a deterrent effect, to be honest. Had we been lax, more would have tried. At some point they gave up and focused on other things. But that's not an argument against vigilance. It actually validates vigilance.
So I asked you the question at the beginning about the things that you would have done differently looking back at the Bush administration. You served on the cabinet. But today, if you were in the Oval with President Biden and you could give him one piece of advice that he'd take on changing the way the U.S. is governing and leading around the world, what would it be?
I would say, and I think he knows this, first of all, I would make sure we are talking to and coordinating with our allies. I understand there was a little bit of a disconnect in terms of our decision in Afghanistan, where some of our close allies claim they weren't consulted. And I do think it's important to hear what they have to say, because part of what we're trying to do is reassure them that we are back and they have our confidence and we have their confidence and we have each other's backs.
Secretary Michael Chertoff, trying his best to help us avoid a GZERO world. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Ian. Take care.
And now to Rory Stewart. He wrote the book, The Places in Between, after spending 36 months walking across Afghanistan. He later served as the UK's Secretary of State for International Development. He believes President Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal was a costly mistake and that we could see an increase in global terrorism because of it. Rory Stewart, thank you so much for joining us on GZERO World.
Great to see you. Thank you for having me.
So with 9/11 and 20 years passing since that tragedy, do you think today the world is considerably more safe, more secure versus terrorist threats than we were back then?
I think in some ways, yes. Certainly true that we have developed much more comprehensive counter-terrorist infrastructure than we had 20 years ago. In other words, for better or for worse, the equivalents of the FBI, the CIA, special forces are able to do far more to focus on terrorism and counter-terrorism. And that has played a significant role in stopping terrorist threats happening, and that also includes the deployment of drones and artificial intelligence and all this kind of stuff. The thing that hasn't dramatically changed over the last 20 years is there are still a very uncomfortable number of very fragile conflict-affected states, and there are very striking numbers of people who are still prepared to endorse a jihadist ideology, and the victory in Afghanistan of the Taliban over the last few weeks will have produced a huge morale boost to jihadists around the world, from Sahel right the way across, who will see this, as they did indeed the ISIS victories in Syria and Iraq, as a sign that they're on their way back.
You've been an outspoken critic of the Biden administration withdrawal from Afghanistan. Tell me why that is.
Because I believe that what we needed in Afghanistan was a light, long-term, sustainable footprint. That there was no reason for him to withdraw in this way, that it was unnecessary and catastrophically damaging to Afghanistan and to American interests.
Catastrophically damaging to American interests. Most Americans, for quite some time, have said that they wanted the United States to withdraw completely. And of course, a lot of Americans can't find Afghanistan on a map. Why do you think, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in that country. Why use a word that's so freighted?
Well, I think let's start firstly from the point of view of Afghans themselves. We've spent 20 years in that country. When I first visited Kabul at the end of the Taliban period, it was a ghost town. It's 300,000 people in a city of 4 million, no cars on the streets, bombed out buildings. I and many, many others worked for nearly 20 years to build things up in Afghanistan. And by the end of that period, it was a very, very different place. One of the things, sadly, that I think maybe American and British voters don't realize is how much better Afghanistan had become. There's become a narrative of suggesting the whole place was a basket case and nothing we were doing was of any use. But the truth is, you could see it in millions of Afghan lives.
Hard to argue for an American domestic audience that Afghanistan is an existential threat or close to it. But do you think that the Americans face knock-on impact from Afghanistan itself?
Well, look, the problem in the US debate is that it's just all black and white. Either this is the most important threat in the world or it's not a threat at all. The answer, of course, is it's somewhere in between, and has always been, right? It was never as important as American politicians pretended between 2001 and 2010, but it's certainly much more important than American foreign policy people are acknowledging today. The answer in very blunt terms is, of course it does. We've just seen 13 American servicemen killed in Kabul by the Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan. That is an extremely brutal international terrorist group operating freely from within Afghan territory and killing American servicemen. So whatever we think about Afghanistan, nobody should be concluding that there are no terrorist threats coming from that, particularly this week.
How much damage do you think has been done to the US-UK special relationship, as we call it, as a consequence of this?
Well, you need to sort of put it back and see it from the British point of view. So since the 1950s, Britain has designed its entire foreign policy and defense policy around the United States. Essentially, Britain around the world has tried to find out what the US is doing and do it at a slightly smaller scale alongside the United States. Everything's designed around the United States. So we went into Iraq with the United States, we went into Afghanistan with the United States, and of course we lost hundreds of lives in Afghanistan fighting an American counterinsurgency warfare strategy, and every one of our generals and every one of our politicians and diplomats was out there repeating the lines from the George Bush administration and the Obama administration about why Afghanistan was so incredibly important. Repeating to our own grieving parents of dead soldiers the US analysis, which was that this was a threat to global security, that we needed to do this, that it was important to defeat the Taliban, that we had a moral obligation to Afghan women, and we were going to stick the course. And throughout that whole period, the United States was very flattering to Britain. Right? When it suits the United States, they're very good at saying, oh, you're absolutely critical to us, we're so grateful for you coming along with us, all these lives you're losing in Helmand make a huge difference to the effort, we really care about you. But at the moment of departure, the US wants to get out, and it appears to forget that it had any partners on the ground at all. There was no real attempt to include Britain in any of these conversations, and through the manner of the departure, the US seems to indicate that this entire story of a partnership or relationship was nonsense. When it suited the US to get a coalition behind it, it could be as charming as it wanted, but when it wanted to leave, any attempt to reach out to other countries and say, do you really think this is sensible? If we're leaving, is there any way that you could fill the gap that we're leaving behind? Can we provide some enablers behind you? 2,500 soldiers is not very many to ask NATO to keep behind when the US leaves. Can we facilitate that in some way? Those conversations were entirely lacking. And as I say, Biden didn't even bother to pick up the telephone to Prime Minister Johnson for 48 hours after Kabul fell. And so that means that if you're Britain, the next time the US is saying, you know, we really want you with us and we want you taking all these lives and risks and political costs because we want you to believe in the American confidence, the consistency of an American vision, America's commitment to its alliances, its moral obligation to people around the world, people are going to be a little bit skeptical.
Rory Stewart, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you see, or even if you don't, but you know it's somehow making you that much of a better person, why don't you take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter? It's called Signal.